the grasshoppers being careless and not planning for the future, and the ants being sort of industrious and working hard every day, we run by grasshoppers who are laughing at the ants, and that never ends well.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey there. Ever feel like the world is spinning out of control? Welcome to The New Rules with Alan Pence. Forget the old playbook. It's toast. We're in a new game now, and this is Alan Pence bringing you 25 years of experience from Capitol Hill to the forefront of business innovation. We're here to show you how to navigate this chaos with precision. Whether it's superpowers jockeying for dominance or inflation shaking things up, we'll help you play 4D chess while everyone else is stuck on checkers. Subscribe now and let's dive in together to master the new rules of the game.
Very excited today to have Sir Stephen Wilkinson on the pod. He is an amazing writer. I would suggest reading his Substack, the Pitchfork Papers. Elegant writer and deep thinker, and also businessman, humanitarian, all sorts of things. So, Sir Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Kind of give us a quick background of what you've been doing.
Yeah, but I'll try and do that very quickly. So I'm an Englishman. I live in Ireland. Spent 27 years of my life in Germany. Moved over to Germany working for an American investment bank as a rookie at the age of 23 or 24 in 1987, having studied German with a focus on medieval German poetry in university, which qualifies you for absolutely nothing. And the reason that I went over to Germany was my first wife was German, and she asked me, what I was intending to do in order to support the family. I thought that was a question she should have asked during the due diligence. And I had two job offers at the time. I had one working for, as I say, an American bank, who were just opening offices all over Europe. It was the year after Big Bang. Big Bang was the year 1986 when Margaret Thatcher effectively freed the city from all its quaint historical trade limitations, and American capital just came pouring in and sort of took over all the major British institutions. And at the same time, in sort of typical American fashion, they said, while we're here, we may as well do Europe. And then started opening offices left, right, and center. And we're just looking for people who can speak the local language, speak English, and could tie a tie. And I think I've sort of fitted all three of those basic requirements. And I spent 27 years in Germany. I spent 3 years at the bank paying off my indenture and my education. I didn't really enjoy it that much, but it did sort of spark an interest in all things financial and economic. I then was hired very bravely by the senior partner of a newly minted wealth management company as his chief strategy officer, sort of one level below the partners, which I thought, looking back on it, was an amazingly brave thing to do. I was 27 maybe, and he was so fed up of the sort of speculative thinking of and short-termism of the people that he had beforehand, that I think he recognized in me a willingness to take a more holistic view and not to be so jittery around what the subject of investment actually was about. And he taught me how to read numbers. So he was ruthlessly disciplined in his approach to numbers and to his insistence on getting facts yourself, doing primary research, and was very quick to point out that just because it's on the internet, or just because it's on that pre-internet days, but just because you've got it somewhere doesn't mean it's true. And that discipline, I think of him and certainly use the training that I got under him every single day of my life. And that having an outstandingly good first proper boss who gives you responsibility, has high expectations, but is extremely exacting in standards without ever getting really personal. I mean, he almost had me in tears a number of times, sort of in his room, apologizing for some oversight or mathematical error. But that did me more good than I think any other phase of my career. So I did that for 5 or 6 years. I gave up. I left that business. I was offered a partnership track, and I knew that if I said yes to that, I'd be doing that for the rest of my life. It was an outstandingly well-run business, run by 3 excellent partners, my direct report being the senior partner there. But he was only about 12 years older than I was. And so I knew I was going to be number 2 for the next 35 years. And my ego couldn't take that. I just thought, no, I don't want to do that. And what I had discovered by that stage was that I wanted to run my own balance sheet. I wanted to have, and I've always thought of a balance sheet as being a canvas that you get to paint on. And it's a permanent reflection of all the things that you are doing and the choices that you're making in your life. And you can either have an intentional canvas, or you can have one that looks as if 3 monkeys have been playing with each other and it splattered all over the place. But I had this idea that I wanted to create my own canvas.
And very Buffett-esque, right?
I had been strongly influenced by Buffett's writings and by Benjamin Graham and the sort of reading around the value investors and the value investing philosophy at a very, very formative stage. I think day one and working for the bank, my buddy next to me, with whom I shared a Reuters screen, said, "Do you want to know what's the most expensive stock on the New York Stock Exchange?" And I said, I have no idea, because I don't know any stocks on the US Stock Exchange. So I don't know. I certainly don't know that one. And he said, put BRK.US into the Reuters machine, and up it popped. This thing that was at the time $2,650. And he said, "Look at that. So that's the most expensive stock." And I thought, yeah, that's very interesting. I couldn't care less. But at the bottom, I saw the quick blurb that Reuters had saying, this is a US holding company run by a conglomerate run by Warren E. Buffett, and he who is actively purchasing US businesses involved in insurance and industrial activities, including the Scott Fetzer Group, which owns the Kirby vacuum cleaner. And I thought, that's interesting, because I've just been sold one by a door-to-door salesman. We just moved to Germany, and he'd sort of pounced on us. I don't know how he found us. I didn't even know there was such a thing as door-to-door vacuum salesman. And I let him in out of pure curiosity, and he managed to sell me one of these things. I think I bought it just to get rid of him, and it was sort of used up most of my cash. So I had a vested interest in knowing that this was a great thing that I'd just done. And I spent the rest of the afternoon reading everything that the system had on this company, because I wanted to know more about my vacuum cleaner, and ended up reading the 1986 shareholder letter that had just been published that previous May. And I thought, and it's funny how these things go, but I found the language, and I don't know whether you remember the 1986 shareholder letter. It's one of the best he ever wrote. It was, he wrote some, there were some outstanding ones, but this was so full of wisdom and intelligence. I thought I could do that. I get that. And in that, I think it was in that letter, or maybe the 1985 one, but he certainly mentions The Intelligent Investor as being the most influential book that he'd ever read at the beginning of his career. I thought, I'm at the beginning of my career. This intelligent man who I feel an automatic empathy towards, and he's the owner of my vacuum cleaner company. I'm going to go and read that book. And I read it. I went to the bookshop, ordered it. It was in English, so I had to wait a week or two before it arrived. And then read it, and I've read it faithfully every single year since then, at least once. And so the sort of Buffett idea of building wealth through judicious investment and being rational And by the way, as a 24-year-old, I was about as far from being rational as it is possible to be. But there must have been some sort of genetic programming in me that said, you need to really look at this stuff. And it fascinated me, and it always has done. And I think Seth Klarman wrote in the introduction to Margin of Safety, which I recommend anybody who is interested in this philosophy of investing read, because it's a genius of a book. He said, value investing is something you either get immediately or you never get it, or you just think it's a waste of time or it's not for you. But I got it immediately as a philosophy. And anyway, I went on and decided I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. And it was in 1988 that I set up my own investment company. And I've been doing that in various different guises ever since. And during the pandemic, so roughly 22 years after I set up the business, I also started doing some advisory work, just because it was fun and I had nothing else to do during that summer. And I've ended up with a practice that is actually quite successful. I didn't mean it to be. That grew out of just an opportunity that came about during the time when we were all sitting in our desks and staring out in the garden.
Yes. Yes. So, an investment company you're running, you're like, you have money from like a registered investment advisor here?
No, I'm not registered anything. It's just me. It's always ever only just been me.
Oh, really? Running your own money?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, fascinating.
Yeah. And I had my primary objective was, because I'm fairly lazy, I had a primary objective that I had to be able to work smartly. I wanted to use what intelligence I had without building any sort of organization around me other than the absolute bare necessities. And I wanted to be able to read to my children and my young family that I started in 1999 with my wife. So we have 4 children, and I wanted to be able to drop my pen at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, go home and be able to read and take my children to bed. And so those are the 2 things that sort of have driven me ever since, actually.
And so this profession met your wife's criteria for making a living?
Well, this is my second wife. The first part of my career, definitely it met the job. It was well paid, far too well paid probably. And by the time I got round to starting my own firm practice, it needn't have been in a firm. It just happened to be that for tax purposes in Germany at the time, it was much more advantageous to put it into a company. And it was also a little bit easier to say to people, okay, I'm managing director of my own company, than to say I sit at home thinking about how I can deploy the little capital that I have. That sort of people tended to sort of stop asking you when they realize, okay, he's got a proper job, or at least it sounds like a proper job. And
I just want to quote from that 86 letter. I love this. He says, "Our prototype for occupational fervor is the Catholic tailor who used his small savings of many years to finance a pilgrimage to the Vatican. When he returned, his parish held a special meeting to get his firsthand account of the Pope. 'Tell us,' said the eager faithful, 'what sort of fellow is he?' Our hero wasted no words. 'He's a 44 medium.'" That's a great. That's the first investment letter you read. You're not going to read a second.
That style, it demystified the whole business, because I thought if somebody who is being touted as being the most intelligent, one of the best, can write with such ease and humor, well, then that broke down a barrier for me immediately. I've been given the first 3 volumes of option pricing by whoever was responsible for me, and I looked at it and thought, I think I'm going to go back to German poetry. But then on sort of day 1, you're reading this humorous, understandable prose from somebody who's obviously wants you to understand what he's doing, and that was infectious for me, and it got me over a hurdle. It got me interested, and I then went on and read all of them, and I tried to go back.
Speaking of writing, I mean, it was at that same time in the pandemic that you started your newsletter. So what was the genesis of that?
I'm a writer. I always have been. I denied myself that epithet once I left university and had to sort of grow up in the real world. And so I didn't do very much writing. I wrote enormous amounts as a child, and even at school, I wrote sort of small novels that I've still got in the shelves behind me somewhere, and unreadable, by the way. but the urge to write has always been very strong, but I suppressed it. And I have a feeling that had to do with the fact that I was in Germany. And I'd been sort of given to understand that that wasn't what was important in life. You have to go make money. And we all do things to please our fathers or to gain their approval, at least I did. And I, in my life, have found that that is not uncommon. And so I ended up doing something that I thought could gain their approval. And I pushed the writing aside, but it was only very much later that I realized, firstly, how much I missed it. And secondly, that it had leaked out into my memos. I was a prodigious memo writer, memos to myself, memos to colleagues, memos to business partners. And I would sort of review them because I kept most of them. I would review them and think, actually, that's quite good. That's quite good writing, and quite good thinking too. And I think sort of I was always collecting other business owners, business people's memos, particularly. I know, again, I don't know whether you ever read Warren Buffett's memo to Catherine Graham, which I first came across in her biography, in which he was explaining the accounting procedures behind pension liabilities, what they were about, which is not exactly a fun topic. But it's a beautifully written memo in the same sort of quirky, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but deeply knowledgeable and style, which showed you that the person who was writing it really wanted you to understand it. He didn't want you to think how clever he was because he was using all this jargon. He wanted you to understand it. And I think I've always had that. That's where it leaked out. I stopped writing poetry at the age of about 22, I think. Although that too kept popping up. But it was only in 2020 that I realized that either you start now or you've buried that ambition forever because you've got no fucking excuse now. We were sitting at home. I knew it was going to last longer than the 2 weeks to stop the curve or whatever it was, flatten the curve. And I thought, it's now or never. So I started, and in the way that you do when you write your first newsletter or your second, you think the entire world is staring at you and going to laugh at you to bits, and nobody's interested and nobody reads it. And once you've sort of got over that initial, actually nobody's interested, then you can really start developing your own style. And that's how Pitchfork Papers started. And the only reason that I called it anything was because I was in a little newsletter group that I joined. Again, what else were you going to do? And everybody seemed to have a name for their newsletter. So I thought, I just literally, it popped out of my head, put it down on the paper. I never thought about it again. And it was during the time I was deeply skeptical of the entire COVID program and the response, deeply skeptical from the get-go. And I'd been sort of prompted into it by an article that was sort of circulating that my wife had sort of shown to me, that she got from some notorious conspiracy lover of who was saying this awful disease coming from China, and there's this letter from a Chinese military officer, and he's high-ranking, and it's just describing how just awful this is, and your eyes are going to melt, and your feet are going to fall off, and it was this long sort of purporting to be from a Chinese military officer. Now, I didn't know one thing from another, but I do know that letter, there was no way that it was ever written by anybody who had not been brought up in England because the language was not that of, it just wasn't anything that a high-ranking Chinese military officer would ever be able to bring to paper. So I thought, this is a load of rubbish. This is no way that this is a first-hand account from anybody who has ever been close to China. And once I got that, I looked at everything else through the lens of this is rubbish. And as it started unfolding, sort of my libertarian basic instinct started kicking in. And And I had the same experience that Tucker Carlson had when he was asked, I think, beginning of this year, when somebody said to him, "How did you know not to take the vaccine? What information did you have?" And he said, "Well, none. I don't have any knowledge of, we all learned far more about immunology than we ever wanted to know in our entire lifetimes. And the difference between complex viruses and simple viruses, and the difference between a corona and Ebola. We all found out much more than we ever wanted to know." But he said, I don't know anything. I don't know anything about vaccines. Don't care one way or the other. I'm sure some of them are good. I'm sure some of them are rubbish. But he said, one thing I did know, I do not trust the people who were forcing me to take it. I didn't trust them. I knew that they were principally, although they were unprincipled, profiteers and probably evil. And I knew that. So anything they were trying to sell me was already, I was already tainted because of who was trying to sell it to me. And I think I had very much the same impression. And once you sort of get into that mindset of critical thinking, doesn't matter where it comes from, you're already on the other side. You're already on the, I always forget, which pill was I taking? Was I taking a
I can't remember whether it's the red or the blue pill.
A colored, yeah, probably important when the moment comes. And that got the ability to, I got there via Pitchfork Papers, so I sort of felt that there was this moment of resisting. And traditionally, the peasants, who didn't have sort of great weaponry and had to fight on principle or at the point of desperation, the pitchfork was the thing that they tended to grab. And I think I must have had one in my hand that morning, turning hay or something. And I thought, yeah, that's where it came from. And the other thing about pitchforks, which I only really rationalized afterwards, was that they are very simple instruments and they are used for turning heavy grass, hay. They're there for getting air into hay. So hay is sort of the substance of life. It's what horses and animals feed off. And the pitchfork is used for turning it, gets air into it, makes it digestible. And I sort of felt, you know what, I can go with that. That's what I try to do. I try to take wet, heavy material and get some air into it.
So in a sense, like, I think the pandemic was a radicalizing event for anybody, certainly for me, vaccine wise, we don't agree.
That's an interesting point, because I'm sure we do agree. I think there is a great deal of point.
We probably do agree.
Vaccinations against complex viruses are absolutely necessary because they're stable. Complex viruses are stable in their structure because their complexity has evolved over, I don't know, a million of years in order to do the thing that they do. But quickly mutating ones, which all coronaviruses are, it's pointless trying to vaccinate against them because they are constantly mutating. So they're simple viruses. So, I think it's Jordan Schachtel has did some great work on that in 2020, end of 2020, beginning of 21. But as I say, I know more about structural composition of vaccines than I ever thought I would need to, and viruses. And so it's not as if they're useless, because otherwise we would probably have many more deaths and debilitating, really fatal diseases. But this one wasn't that. It was something else.
Right. I mean, I guess for me, what was really alarming, and look, I'm a cynical person. I worked on the Hill for 5 years. I've been around government. I have a company that consulted the government for 17, 18 years. So I know the government. And even so, it was alarming to me how the herd mentality took over. And, I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. So like I'm in the heart of blue, right? And just the almost like looking at the response of somebody like Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, who published this great Barrington Declaration, and the people associated with him, and just how they were demonized and destroyed, and how people just lost all sense of cost benefit completely. Like the harm reduction had to go to zero. Like, my kids' school, they were making them wear N95 masks, and like this virus doesn't do that much to kids. And you're just like, what is going on? Like, you have no sense of like the trade-offs here. And like what we did to the kids who, we were sponsoring, our PTA was sponsoring kids to just come to our school because they could do after school stuff, just so they would have internet, some of these kids from impoverished areas. And just to me, the entire thing was like, oh my God, like our society is like not very well put together here. And it was just really shocking, even though I had, I'd seen plenty of government incompetence over the years and cynical behavior, but it was really shocking. I look at it less as a conspiracy rather than just a complete failure, right? And it set me off writing my newsletter. I mean, it's the exact same impetus. It's like, what is going on here? Why have things changed, or have they changed? I don't know. Maybe I was delusional the entire time.
What drew me to your writing was always your very measured weighing of facts and possibilities. Your writing is suffused with this need to take the heat off things and to be balanced in your assessment. And I really appreciate that. There are very few voices that write as authoritatively as you do on difficult matters of economic policy without tending towards dramatization. And I read your stuff and it always gives me pause for thought, always. I like to go out sort of on the edge, not too far, and I like to be respectful of other opinions. And I don't like to shove my opinion down anybody's face, but I will try to be slightly to take an left or right of field position rather than taste too much in the middle. But your thinking and your writing always acts as a corollary to my understanding, and I always think very respectfully about the way that you frame issues, which is what sort of draws me back to your writing every time you publish.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I kind of look at it similarly. I think you have sort of a dark view because, like, you talk a lot about fourth turning and these sort of cycles. And I think where I've gotten, it's kind of interesting, and I'm curious, this is what I wanted to kind of get into the meat of, is I think I've gotten to this thing where I think what happened is the United States, and I look at it, I'm an American, so I look at it from this perspective, is we were so powerful for so long and so economically and militarily both that basically there were no consequences and nothing to discipline our behavior. So we, as a result, went off and launched wars. We could indulge in crazy, social projects. And there was just no bill to be had, right? Because they just put it on the account, right? And that world kind of ended. It probably ended in the great financial crisis, but they were able to keep things going. But really, the pandemic, I think, showed the end of that. And that now there are costs. Now the trade-offs are becoming apparent. Now China is an actual competitor, right? And we see how dangerously dependent we are on them for certain things. And, or we can't restrain Russia or Israel, or we just can't get everything we want anymore. And like now, and I think the system is spasming because it still thinks it runs the world, and it's increasingly apparent it doesn't. And that now that competition is going to, and that sense of consequence will discipline our action over time. And so as a result, I just wrote on Sunday, like, I think that basically AI would have been killed by permitting and lack of electricity and some crazy bill in California, or just like the EU did, right? But it's the fear of the Chinese that will drive it forward. And we'll plow right through the environmental lobby to make sure that there's enough electricity so we stay ahead of the Chinese. So I think in a way, it's like almost this sense of consequence and change has like driven us to get serious again. But not quite yet, but we're getting there, right?
Yeah.
And so that's sort of my take. And I don't look at, like, I have problems with things like the fourth turning because it seems like we don't have enough data, there's not enough sample size, I think there are ideas there that make sense to me, but I'm curious your kind of sense of like where we are.
I think there is a logic to the idea of a generational pattern that starts after a secular crisis, or secular in the word, in the sense of a period, epoch, that there is a crisis, usually technology driven, where one hegemon replaces another, or the one hegemon is replaced by a multipolar world or something. And the generation that is tasked with rebuilding the institutions has an entirely different mindset to the generation for sort of G4. So G1 rebuilds, G2 expands, G3 enjoys, G4 depletes. And that's a constant theme in human nature. Read it in literature, you can read it in history. So there is something to it, that generations have different characters. And if you then add into the mix this epoch that is coming to an end, and it's difficult to know where it started, but let's just say it genuinely started when America emerged from the Second World War as, without doubt, the strongest nation on the planet. And I don't know whether you've been to the New Orleans World War II Museum, but it is unbelievable. One of the most powerful museums that I've ever been to. And you take a day to go through it. And there's a film at the beginning. And it was only by watching this film, which is narrated by Tom Hanks, and it's a huge sort of film, maybe an hour long, that you watch before you go into the actual exhibitions, which sort of gives you the background. But the idea that this one nation of then, I don't know, 180 million people, or 210 million people, whatever the population was 80 years ago, was capable of fighting not just one war, but two at the same time in two different hemispheres, with the most overwhelming military technology, power, mass, size, scale, and replaceability. It was just extraordinary. You have a sense of why America earned that position. Its industrial retooling capabilities and the sheer mass of people it was able to mobilize with a vision and with values to go and fight these two deeply imperialist, fascist claims on it, which without actually ever being attacked itself, unless you count Hawaii. It was extraordinary. And so America's position, if we start the latest seculum there, and we look that we're now sort of getting on for 100 years, maybe 95 by the time it's finished, that pattern seems to make sense. And it wouldn't be anything more than of historical interest if it wasn't for the very parlous situation in which the country's financial position is. And what I do believe deeply is that money influences ethics, and money production has a deeply ethical component. And call me old-fashioned, but if I look at sort of the old stories of the grasshopper and the ants, the grasshoppers being careless and not planning for the future, and the ants being sort of industrious and working hard every day, we're run by grasshoppers, and who are laughing at the ants, and that never ends well. I also think that from the moment that America decided, and it all happened around about the same time, everybody puts the actual moment of America's ethical decline in terms of money production to August of 1971, when Richard Nixon untethered the dollar for the first time in history from any physical restriction. So the giving up of the gold conversion, even if it was only theoretical, was the moment of that was the original sin. I don't think it was. I think you have to go back to 1963 that the nation suffered a deeply traumatizing event through the assassination of JFK by, I think now indisputably, by its own security forces. So this is the Praetorian Guard killing Caesar because it was getting in the way, because he threatened to get in the way of their imperialist expansion ideas and their power. And I have a feeling, and I'm a great fan of sort of Swedish crime genre. There's my favorite author is Håkan Nesser, whose stories always revolve around some deep crime, some secret, some dirty secret that was buried 30, 40 years ago that suddenly emerges like a monster from the swamp and destroys the lives of all the people who were trying to hide it or kept it underground.
Like
or
the golem comes.
The golem comes back. And my sense is that America crossed the threshold with the murder of its commander-in-chief, and that original sin marred and influenced pretty much every single policy decision that came out of it. They had to, the man they chose to run the country after him, his commitment to a heinous war that was entirely pointless, the massive incursion of debt and human capital that caused, led directly to the French pulling the plug on the gold system by de Gaulle insisting on having, I think it was $1 million worth of gold that he changed, of dollar bills that he wanted exchanging into gold, sending a very clear signal to Nixon in 1970. I think it was just before Christmas that it happened. And within 6-7 months, they'd made a decision that they weren't going to be held to ransom by the bloody French or anybody else, and that they needed to uncouple. And I think that all went back to the original sin. And I think that marked the character of the US and or at least its organizing bureaucracies and maybe political structure, because they got away with it, but it haunted them. And it's the end result of that, I think, is coming now. And it's no accident that those files are going to be opened and made public and probably verifying what everybody knows through the various films and Oliver Stone documentaries and exposures. And I think it's no accident that that's happening now. This is the denouement moment.
Is it 50 years or something that the date?
Yeah, but they haven't. They've kept it locked up for another 20.
Okay.
Or 25.
So do you read Doomberg, by the way?
I am friends with the Doomberg team. Yeah.
Yeah. So I got into it with him a little bit about the Kennedy stuff and relating it to Trump on his newsletter. I love it.
It's a what? Team. It's a
he wrote some stuff about relating the Trump assassination attempt to the Kennedy assassination, and I went after him a little bit on his newsletter, or him, whoever the main person responding was. It's a team of people, but I guess I don't share that view. I don't really know, but I think I'm less conspiracy minded. But I would say I kind of agree with the broad strokes of so I would interpret it a little differently. I would say, coming out of World War II, the US was the dominant, not only military power, but also probably even more so the economic power.
More so, yeah, definitely.
And so in order to fight this, I kind of take I don't know if you know Michael Pettis, right? He's he's an American teaching at Tsinghua University in Beijing, former trader. He writes a lot about economic policy.
A former teacher?
Former trader. He's sort of like reviving these Keynesian ideas from actually in the formation of the original Bretton Woods system. Keynes disagreed with going to a dollar standard, a gold standard, backed by gold. He said we should create this international clearing currency called Bancor because we controlled everything back then and we were the dominant economy. The Treasury Secretary, I can't remember his name, 3 names.
Blumenthal, wasn't it?
No, it was like, I can only think of Harry Dean Stanton, the actor, but it was somebody like those 3 names.
Dean Acheson.
Yeah, it was somebody like that. He was like an assistant treasury person. He basically said, no, we're going to do it. And so I do think what happened is that we created this coalition to fight the Soviets, and we allowed countries like, quite frankly, Europe at first, to run beggar thy neighbor development policies where they would not import very much and be export focused, right? And then we did that in Korea, South Korea, and we did it with Japan. And that was fine in the 50s and 60s when the United States was still the, 50% of GDP or more. But over time, that system started, the other countries started getting bigger, and their share of world GDP got bigger. And the only response that we can have to people manipulating their currency or subsidizing their exports is to either run debt in the private or public sector, or to have really high unemployment. Those are your choices, right, in that system, if you don't balance the trade. And because we set up the system to fight the Soviets, we let it run through the end of the Cold War, and then stupidly allowed China to run that policy at even higher level, right, coming into the 2000s. And so really the problem didn't start with China. The real tipping point was your point in 70, whatever it was, 71, when we went off the gold standard.
But Keynes's original conception, and the reason that the Treasury Secretary didn't want to do it or didn't sign up for it, was because his idea of balancing would have meant that not just that deficit countries would have to do something, but surplus countries would have to do it.
Right.
So surplus countries would have to pay into the fund in order to equalize. And America was surplus. They said no. In the same way that the Germans, who were constantly, or used to be when they had some inkling of economic sanity in their policy making, and the Bundesbank was still running the show, the Bundesbank or the German politicians were absolutely adamant that if everybody was as virtuous as they were, in other words, if everybody worked hard and saved and exported, well, then it would be fine. And when I remember addressing a group of German parliamentarians, cross-party, one evening in Berlin, and saying, well, you do know that international trade is in sum a zero-sum game. It has to be. For every dollar that you export or euro, there is somebody else who has that on the other side of the ledger. Every single penny. And it's impossible for everybody to be in surplus. It just doesn't work. And they sort of
Harry Dexter White, by the way, was the
Harry Dexter White. Germany's insistence on seeing their surplus as something virtuous, while everybody else in Europe is suffering from massive deficits, is breaking the system. That's why I've always been. I mean, I've not been right.
It's going to break the euro.
Right? Well, I've been saying that for 20 years, but nobody. But I've been consistently wrong.
They've destroyed the EU, I think, in a sense, because in reality, Germany was not a surplus country until the Hartz-Berg reforms or whatever. They had labor reforms by Schroeder in the early 2000s, Hartz, yeah. And that's what really drove them into surplus, right? And it's been since then that I think they're breaking the EU. And I think the US, so I think, the original sin to me was the system that the US ran that turned against them. But in doing so, over time, we became the debtor nation, but it creates a series of elites who benefit from the system, right?
Right.
So
then
because
we go back to Cantillon, and we know how that works.
Right. And so Wall Street makes a ton of money because China has to recycle its export earnings back into US assets, right? That's the only way they can keep the yuan from shooting up in value. And Wall Street makes a vig off of that. And our national security elites love it because they have this delusion that they can control the world financial system, which, is being shown to be a little weaker than we thought. And so to me, that's been the problem. And the result of this allowing of exports to take, these surplus countries to export to the United States and to Britain, all the Anglophone countries basically have these open capital markets. it's destroyed the manufacturing bases of these countries. And I mean,
course.
Great Britain is even worse than the United States. We're 11% of our economy is manufacturing. I think it's down to 9 in the UK.
Yeah, it's dreadful.
And those are the people out there rioting about immigrants, right? I mean, that it's those communities that were destroyed in service of giving London a bigger financial vig off of
Yeah.
the recycled capital, right? So to me, that's what's happened, is this great distortion of the system that had, and quite frankly, I think it started here in the 60s, and it hit inner city African-American communities first. And then it started spreading out. And like in the 80s, we were able to contain it somewhat. We did these Plaza Accords with Japan, and we forced them to appreciate the yen,
Yep.
which led to that big boom and their crash. So we were able to kind of contain it a bit. But now with China, we can't, because they're not under our military. They're not gonna sign up for Plaza Accords, right? Because they're not under our umbrella. And I think now we're facing the entire reordering of the system. And I think it's
Right, but
going to
that reordering does not happen quietly.
no. And I think
It-
Trump was the first starting gun. What's going to happen? I mean, today we're voting, right? So who knows? Like if he comes in, hey, we have all out full scale trade war and reordering of the system, but something's got to happen. It's just not sustainable anymore.
Yeah, my sense is that we've got, irrespective of who gets in, we will have inflationary policies, and we
Yeah,
will have
have
a good time boom ahead of us, irrespective of who gets in, for the next 2 years. And I think the second half of the decade will prove to be amongst the most difficult of the last 100 years, is my guess.
That's interesting. So you see this, like, whatever they will result in some kind of boom, like a 20s type thing, right?
Yeah, I
Where
do.
asset prices go to their final,
Yeah, I do.
you know.
And I think all the people who are doomsaying, the Ray Dalio and Stanley Druckenmiller and all the people that, and Paul Tudor Jones and all the people who have been very vocal in their end of the cycle vocabulary. It's over. This is unsustainable. It's going to break. All of them. They have got to be proven wrong in the short term. Because, you know, I've got Dalio's book here somewhere, but they've all brought their books out now. They've all been writing essays now. They've all been very articulate around why they believe the system is coming to an end now. They have to be made to look foolish first. And only when they're not going to recant, or they may do, they may have a sort of Newtonian recanting moment in just before the top.
That's
But I think
Newton investing in the South Sea bubble, right? And
Yeah.
he sold out and then bought in again right at the top, right before.
Isaac Newton, that was, I think. And so I think that has to happen, because at the moment there's still too much caution and uncertainty, probably by the election. My suspicion is that Trump 3.0 will win today, turn tomorrow. It'll be a very messy time up until he's actually inaugurated, with all sorts of legal contests and attempts to declassify or to disqualify the election result. But you know, that's par for the course nowadays. And then I think with full control, he will then turn the spigot on in a way that he will. He'll probably do some cost cutting through Elon and go after the pharma companies with Robert, and who knows who else is going to do, and probably Tulsi Gabbard is going to get her chance to stick the knife into Homeland Security, which has been dying to do. And so you'll probably see cost cutting on the one hand, showing some short-term results. You'll see definitely inflationary policies, with both Congress and Senate being controlled by the Republicans, I'm guessing, because not that I know anything about the composition of it and how that's going to work. Those are just the ideal conditions for what I think is going to happen economically afterwards. And then there'll be the setup for the fall, in the same way that Hoover was, a pro-business Republican who happened to be, unfortunately, in the middle of his first term and last term when the Depression hit, and was incapable of structurally managing the fallout. I suspect that's what's going to happen this time too.
So how do you see the break happening then? Like what?
The actual triggering mechanism is impossible to foresee. But all I can tell you is usually one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So it's either war, disease, economic catastrophe, or something, or societal break, something like that. Might be a bank collapsing. It might be. I mean, these things usually work with an over-leveraged bank, usually a small player in the system that triggers sort of a domino effect through the interconnection of swaps and options and hedges, causing systemic collapse throughout it. And it's probably going to be so big this time that you won't be able to hold it up. That's my guess.
My guess is it's a Chinese collapse of some sort. My theory is that at some point, the US is going to, I think Trump probably brings it sooner, but maybe Harris puts it off a bit. But the US will have to shut its markets, at least at some level. We're already seeing it with EVs. We'll see it with robotics, AI. They're going to have to shut their markets to the Chinese. I always thought that Europe would go along with the Chinese, but it's looking like they might even need to, follow with the United States, but who knows? We'll see. But I think the problem, and if Europe does it, then it's really a big deal. I think Germany's not ready to go there yet, but there is just no other demand center in the world that can absorb Chinese production besides the United States. And if we lead the UK, Europe, others into a new trade system, try to push China out. Now, there's certainly risks to the United States. We have a ton of stuff that we're getting from there. I think the writing's on the wall. Now, it could be delayed by we only do certain kinds of tariffs, not maybe.
So you and I are we're in agreement that we're in dangerous waters, and it's probably there's going to be some reckoning as a result of the financial irresponsibility of the last.
And I think China's just not going to be able to keep its people employed, and once that happens, country goes into full meltdown. And I don't, maybe that might be the extreme case, but maybe that's a lash out to Taiwan. Maybe who knows? But I think it's going to revolve around that issue.
That's fascinating, and one of the things that I thought we were going to talk about was what's the effect of that going to be on small businesses? But I think we're running out of time. We may have to do another one.
Yeah, we'll have to. Yeah, no, I actually think positively, like you, I think in the aftermath of that system, right, it probably, it's going to hurt global players, it's going to hurt the Magnificent Seven, and it's going to be good for small value companies, right? Small manufacturers, Eventually, yeah. But I agree that we probably have another burst now and then move in. But you are moving quickly toward your quitting time today, so
yeah,
we can't keep you too long. No, but it's been fascinating, and we've covered a lot right now. So yeah, next time we talk about what the aftermath looks like, and
super. Well, thank you very much for having me on. When does it go out?
We'll probably do it next week, I think.
Cool. I look forward to it.
So I'll have.
I look forward to an enormous boost in my Pitchfork Papers subscribers.
There you go. Yeah, go to Pitchfork Papers. Sir Stephen Wilkinson on Substack and subscribe.
Or awesome. I'll be on stage next week at Grant Williams's event that he's hosting with Steph Pomboy. To be honest, I don't know why I'm being invited, other than that Grant evidently finds it amusing to talk to me, and he's invited me to come on stage with him.
Where's that?
That'll be in Tampa.
In Tampa, okay.
Yeah, Petersburg, St. Petersburg. So, thank you very much. It's great talking to you.
Great to meet you.
Let's catch up again soon. Take care. Bye.
See ya. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The New Rules with Alan Pence. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow @apentz, that's APENTZ, on X, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.